everybody. Welcome to This Week in Innovation. Today's subject is synthetic data, what it is and why it's valuable to retail. Solomon Ray and Sharmran Jacob, both of Iterate.ai, joined Brian and I for a discussion on the role synthetic data can play in retail. In an earlier podcast, we discussed the problem of bias in AI. The problem essentially is not enough data or not enough clean data. Synthetic data is a methodology of generating data using artificial intelligence and neural networks to create data to fill in the gaps of retailers of their existing data. Give it a listen and let us know what you think. Hey, Brian, good morning.
Good morning, Jeff. How are you?
Outstanding. So, Brian, today we talk about the 5 forces of innovation, and one of those forces I would probably argue, and I think you'd agree, one of the key force is data. But we talked a lot about data in the last pod and also about the bias in data. So I'm curious if the 5 forces of innovation is based on, or the foundation for that is data, what happens if there's problems in the data? Is there a solution for that?
It's a great question, Jeff. In fact, there is a lot of problems and challenges in collecting data. In this episode today, we are going to talk about one of such challenges. There are many challenges. This is one of the challenges, especially traditional organizations face. What I mean by traditional organizations is organizations whose core business is not technology, but rather services and products that are not technological. But technology is a key part to reach to the consumers. The travel industry, the healthcare industry, the beauty retail industry, the insurance industry, industries in the automobile industry. So there are several industries that can take advantage of what we're going to be talking about today. And the problem essentially is not enough data or not enough clean data. Right. One of the ways this problem is mitigated is by using synthetic data. So synthetic data is a methodology of generating data using AI, artificial intelligence, and neural networks to create data or simulate data that somewhat looks natural or similar to the data that you would find in a real environment. You may ask, so how is this applicable to various industries? Give me some examples, Brian, where the rubber hits the road. Let me give you a simple example. In the case of the beauty industry, you want to have profiles of consumers across all skin colors and all skin tones. By using synthetic data, you could generate that type of a profile of people without actually having to capture people's skin tones across that diverse profile. You could do that by learning from your existing user base and superimposing it across various types of skin tones. This can also be applicable in various other industries like the automobile or the insurance industry. You're looking at damages of vehicles. Damages can be superimposed across several vehicles. You can also look at the medical industry for various forms of diseases on various types of organs, spread of things like cancer. You could create imposing of that data on other organs. So there are all kinds of very powerful applications that's coming in. One of the things, Jeff, I am excited about is this also puts a lot of the traditional companies whose core business is not technology in sort of a level playing field with the big Amazons, Apples, Googles of the world when it comes to data. Because one of the biggest challenges with traditional companies is that they just don't have the right data. And even though they've had access to the right data, they probably didn't collect them over the years. The other problem is some of them have collected data, but is sitting in silos across various organizations. So all these type of problems are there. And by generating and using data that is created by machines, we can actually provide better algorithms and better working of AI solutions, because the greatest AI algorithm or platform is useless without the data. Even a mediocre AI algorithm or a platform is far more powerful with the right data. So data, like you said, is the oil. It is the oil. It is the oil that runs a machine, right? So you want to be able to put the highest quality premium oil. And today we have to be talking about the synthetic oil. And one of the things I also want to do at this moment is turn around a bit and ask Solomon this question. Our audience have met Solomon before. Our listeners who have listened to previous podcasts, you probably heard Solomon. For those who don't know, Solomon is a director of innovation at Iterate.ai. So Solomon, tell us a little bit about some of these applications of synthetic data and how synthetic data is using various models of AI, and unpack us a little bit about what's happening underneath the covers.
Sure thing, Brian. I'll start with what I mentioned first. Privacy issues are really, really important for retailers. As we know, there are compliance issues and also just generally uh, safety approaches and security approaches to taking care of customer data. Privacy concerns that actually limits the amount of data that organizations can collect and use. What we can do is use synthetic data to compensate those data sets and their statistical properties with high accuracy. The reason this is really effective, because if you think about the way traditionally data is collected and how it's cleaned up to use, you can have a customer's data and you can clean it as much as you want, but the risk to it is very high because it still has a lot of sensitive information. If you go in the other direction where you try to anonymize a lot of information, that will decrease your risk, but at the same time, you're going to lose a lot of valuable information. So using synthetic data, what you can do is take a lot of your data and expand it and essentially take that original data and then take pieces of it and oversample it in your data set while retaining those statistical properties. And in this method, according to mostly AI, 99% of the information in the original data can be retained on average. This is significantly higher than just using classic anonymization methods that a lot of retailers use. So we see this as something that's really effective and at the same time can retain all these compliance and security issues for privacy. Next, when we talk about using AI or machine learning models for training, synthetic data is very useful because for AI, we see the data types being not just tabular and text data, but we can also see images, video, media that's really, really flexible for using AI. And as Brian alluded to in the beauty industry, for example, using a lot of images to train models and identify skin tones, sometimes you just don't have that data available. So using AI methods such as GAN, generative adversarial networks, to create different skin tones or synthetic human faces to train your data to more accurately understand your consumer base and the product recommendations for that is very valuable.
So, Solomon, you're saying essentially is there are two, if I catch it right, there are two major areas. One area is the privacy because as you know, the existing mobile platforms like Apple's locking down on what kind of data you could collect for the ads, right? And then there are a lot of restrictions and compliance requirements on the type of data that could be collected for a given customer. So that could be an area from prior profiles and prior capabilities you could synthetically generate new data. So that's one area, right? If I understood you correctly. The other area I was also mentioning in the beginning is probably the capability to generate data where there are lots and lots of gaps for the type of data that retailers and brands were never able to collect, right? Just because either they have not thought about collecting in the past or they just don't have access to that. So these are kind of the examples of what we are looking at: the automobile industries and insurance industries, damage assessment, and actuarial kind of capabilities. Same thing kind of applies in, like you said, in the medical, healthcare, and many other industries. But I think this is definitely an interesting field, Jeff, because there is so much going on in here, and it's also one of the things I really, as I said, mentioned before, is this is putting a lot of retailers, even brands and traditional organizations in sort of a level playing field to be able to generate pretty good high quality data to train their machines and their systems.
So, Brian, is this a market opportunity? Will there be synthetic data brokers? Will retailers create their own synthetic data? How does this all evolve?
So I think initially the way this will play out is retailers will end up working with vendors who are either providing data platforms. In my mind, I would break them into sort of three pieces. One is basically purely like the data platform enablers, companies that are today working with your CDP, your customer data platforms. And the other breakdown would be players who are providing you AI platforms. I mean, just like ourselves, right? Like Interplay, right? AI platforms. Or you would actually have providers who are providing data platforms, like just big data management, the platform, even players like Google, right, in their BigQuery and other areas. So these three types of vendors, right? They could be startups, they could be established companies. They will enable the retailers and brands to help create the data. One of the things that's really beautiful about this industry, which I really love, Jeff, is that in the traditional software world, when a vendor comes in and builds software, that software the platform is actually owned by the vendor. And then, of course, it's licensed to the retailer. In the data and the AI world, things have changed, especially we are seeing a lot of different types of licensing and deals, right? The retailers and brands can actually own their data. Not only can they own their data, the original data, they could own the generated data. They could also own the models. Right. And the software that generate these models could still be owned by the vendor, but the models themselves and the data could still be owned by the retailers, which will give them tremendous amount of leverage for the retailers and even like traditional companies to become these new creators, these new oil miners, right? The quote that we were reading before, data is the new oil. Now we are talking about how do you create synthetic, which is really interesting to think about if you draw up the parallels. Another thing that's interesting also, Jeff, is that there is quite a lot of funding going into this industry, right? I think from 2016 onwards, you've seen VCs funding about $78 million. I repeat it, $78 million in startups. Not a lot of money, but that's significant amount of capital just to show that this space is large enough to make investments. The other thing that's also interesting is that in a total, within I think over 5 or 6 years, $210 million have got poured into it. So there's quite a lot of money in this space. And then they also predict, based on various data pieces we've gathered, it is still at an early stage. I think it's about 12.7% CAGR growth in this type of training market. And then, I know the natural next question you're going to ask, is this a sort of a new market? Which markets does it tie into? Right? I think it's a very valid question, I'm sure. The thing is, what's going to be really interesting is I think it sort of taps into two existing markets. One market is the data market, right? Data providers and the data market. The other market is the AI platform market. This is something that's in between, right? Because AI systems are used to generate synthetic data, but then the data platforms also have to provide these capabilities in case where the data is not enough or they have to complement data. This type of things can just be complement capability. So I think it'll kind of touch into two markets. It'll be like a subsections in two markets, right? I think the primary market for this or the categorization, if you were to think, would be the AI data training market, AI training market, right? That is kind of the primary market this will fall under.
So, Brian, there's probably 500 to 600 tier one retailers greater than $1 billion in revenue in North America. Of those 500 or so tier one retailers, how many are using synthetic data today, do you think?
I think under 5%.
Wow.
But I think what's interesting, though, is they are all, most of them, to my understanding and my expectation, at an early experimental stage, thinking about how they could apply synthetic data for their business problems, a different set of problems that they have, right? But what's really interesting about this area, Jeff, is unlike other problems in AI, like bias, like AI bias, which we spoke about last time, this synthetic data problem is highly scalable. What I mean is once you understand your use case and once you experiment with your data models, you can generate a lot of data a lot faster. So the propagation of this will be much faster than solving more complicated problems like AI bias, other leading machine learning problems. And this also might be an interesting moment, Jeff, to introduce Shamron into our discussion. For our listeners who don't know who Shamron is the machine learning manager at iterate.ai. Shamron, tell us about what are some of the upcoming innovations and R&D that you are seeing in this synthetic data market?
Thanks, Brian. So I would actually like to resonate with what Brian and Jeff said both. So both of them started their pitch with synthetic data is a way of reducing bias, which is 100% correct. And second is synthetic data is a way to generate a lot of data, which a lot of companies struggle to deal with today. 9 out of 10 times, companies who want to get into AI and building models and using all these fancy things to predict and solve problems outside in the world. They want to do this, but they can't get into this issue because they don't have any data. And the money to spend to collecting that data is a lot, and time as well. You can't just collect data overnight. You just can't have people sitting and doing it for you. And even if you manage to do that, the data will be so biased that you'll basically run into issues where it's almost like not useful. So one of the biggest reasons why people are looking into generating synthetic data is to reduce bias. That's A. And to basically get on speed with other competitors out there who are really running fast with AI, but they are they're getting into this, but they don't have time to waste and go slow at it. So they really want to generate data and start using it and start generating models and start solving problems. So one of the places where synthetic data is getting picked up, and I'll tell you, there are basically three types of data which are heavily used today. One is text, one is time series, and one would be image. These three are heavily used in the world of AI. Most of the companies, actually everyone would be doing one of the three somewhere, somehow, and they'll be heavily using this. So synthetic data is actually the concept of generating data in these three fields is something that people focus on heavily today. Text, and very classic example of text would be Alexa, the customer dialogues when you tell Alexa to do something and it does it for you. This customer dialogues, there was no way of collecting it, but synthetic data can be a shortcut to collecting these millions of customer data. That's the fastest way to do this is synthetic data. You collect and you have a model that generates synthetic data for you with customer models, and you turn around and train Alexa, and boom, within overnight, your Alexa is 1,000 times more smarter, and it can do many more things than just what it does today. So that is something.
Also, Shamron, you touched on a really great point, because that means for natural language processing, synthetic data can be used in a significant way. That means this also will unpack customer care. So Jeff, imagine guest services and customer care centers collecting data, and you want to enable more intelligent AI agents to tackle customer care problems, right? Which is a problem across every organization. It's sort of is what we call a horizontal problem, right? But in the cases where the proper set of data is not collected in customer care, with your existing data, you could synthetically generate data for these systems. Is that correct, Shamron?
That is correct, man. Absolutely. And I was going to actually quote an OpenAI project, which is called GPT-3. So that's a very popular generative pre-trained transformer, and it's series 3. The whole purpose of the transformer is to generate human-like text. That's all it does. It just crawls the internet, learns from it, and it generates human-like text. And it has actually, the reason it's series 3 is it's because it's reached a level where it can actually write articles, and it has published articles on Guardian. And while you read it, you will not even figure out if it's a human who wrote it or if it's a robot that wrote it.
Hey, I don't like that idea at all. It sounds like you're trying to replace analalists. Yes.
That is correct. That is correct. That's exactly what it does. And when I read this article, I actually didn't figure out it was written by a robot till the end, where it actually says that I'm a robot who wrote this. So we have reached that far in the world of generating synthetic data that you can actually write things, and then you can actually generate that much data that actually it's indistinguishable between the real one and the synthetic one. It's coming there right now.
So that means we are getting very close to passing the Turing test.
Correct.
Wow.
That is correct, yes. The second most popular would be not image actually. I would say the second most popular would be the time series. Again, it's very popular in the world of AI. Everyone wants to use it. Credit card fraud detection, refined algorithms for high frequency trading, etc., etc. Again, data doesn't exist at all. And this is something people are looking into every single day of generating synthetic data, where you can use this and you can solve tons of problems out there. Very popular type of data that people are looking into. The third one, which is actually getting used today, is image data. And I don't know if a lot of people, I'm pretty sure you know it, there's a video game called Grand Theft Auto. It's very popular. It's a real life video game where you actually can do whatever you do in real life, but in a video game. They actually use synthetic data as training purpose. They generate the autonomous vehicle camera inputs. That's how they generate the whole input as a human. What would you do when you sit in a car? Or when you're driving, how does the field look around you? Or how do I make a car hit your car when you're crossing a light? All these things have been generated using synthetic data. Like, they don't have data for this. So this is, again, it's already there, and it's picking up so fast that they're already testing it in a video game. And this video game is, the reason why it's this popular is because of this, because the way they've trained their models to give you a very, very real time feel while playing the game, again, based on synthetic data only, nothing else. They did not have anything. So, and then again, they use Ganj as the bag, which is obviously the biggest, the most favorite in the world of AI when it comes to synthetic data. And as soon as COVID happened, a lot of people started looking into X-rays for COVID-19 for using synthetic data, because there is no data for COVID. and people want to get into this field of solving this issue with AI and machine learning, but where is the data? They don't have it. So that's, again, very popular image data, synthetic data / generating process that's going on. So in future, what I think is going on right now is we are working towards, that's level one, where we are working towards generating synthetic data. That's level one. That's where we are today. Once we get past that, which is going to be very soon, because most of the companies out there have figured out a way somehow to generate this data. So once we get past that, then we will use that whole process of generating synthetic data and train models to do that for you. So you'll eventually go down level 2, where you have models running who will be generating the synthetic data for you. That's going to be level 2. Level 3 would be where you'll train the models that will develop other models for you, basically AKA code. That's what's going to happen. You're going to have models that will sit and write code for you using the synthetic data. So you can eventually have other models running. So we're going to get to a point where you're going to replace manual coding process, because you have generated so much synthetic data that you can actually train other things using that and use it further. So we are in a very exciting times when it comes to synthetic.
This is also interesting, right, Shamran, because because of all these code generations and ability for platforms to generate data. And I think, Jeff, we also touched a little bit about this is actually a very scalable initiative within organizations. What I mean is, once you understand your data and you get started, you can keep going and prospering faster, because you can get things out to market very quickly. This might also be an interesting opportunity, Shamron, for things like low-code platforms, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. Essentially, like, because if low-code platforms could have Lego-type blocks that could generate this type of data, you could put in an input, just like the way we do in Interplay today, where you could put in a data file of various conversations and their intent, and it could automatically train very quickly and build models, an intent-based model using various transformers. Same technique could be used to generate synthetic data with you input the data, and then various types of domain transfer techniques, rules are set, and it could actually begin to generate this data pretty easily. And what I'm also excited is that if things like this happens at a drag and drop basis, it'll kind of democratize the usage of this for a lot of organizations.
Yep, that's actually great. And to touch to that point, if we can get to a place where low code can generate synthetic data, imagine how fast you can remove bias. Because you can say, okay, I know class A is 70% bias. I need class B to get to 70. So your low code can generate class B just like that, instead of you sitting and manually making data and crawling the web and getting data out. So that'll reduce the whole bias issue in one shot. And then that'll basically solve a lot of issues in no time and speed things up. That's the biggest way of doing things, speed things up in low code. So yeah, totally.
Interesting. So if we're at 5% of tier 1 retailers that are playing with synthetic data today, what percentage will that be in 4 years from now, do you figure?
I think this is something that will have fast growth, right? And it'll be propagated by vendors. Today, we were just tracking vendors in this space. And I think there are north of 60 companies playing in this space. And then also some traditional
Brian,
companies.
60 vendors playing or selling to how many ever number of end user clients? Okay.
Absolutely. So, I mean, this is still a prediction. I mean, none of us know what the future is, and we don't have a crystal ball. But I think at a higher level, I mean, it'll be easily north of 40, 45, 50%. Because this is one of those things that are highly scalable. Once you know what the data is, once you know what your use case is, it's turning, with a little bit of training, it's turning on a faucet. As companies vendors get good at doing this, they train their models across a lot of data, you'll get to a point where this generation becomes norm and sort of table stake.
Does that mean there needs to be new skill sets inside retail organizations to handle synthetic data or to understand that? Or does that kind of kick back into the whole AI bias question we talked about last week?
No, I think what's really interesting is that once the data is generated and once it's used in various models, most retailers and brands are actually hiring or putting together AI teams or data teams. I mean, as you know, in the 2007 to 2016 timeframe, big data was making a big wave. And a lot of retailers have already made investments. They have big data teams or data teams, right? Some of them are now adding AI engineers to those data teams. So those resources will be used essentially to kind of be playing in a liaison roles with the vendors to solve some of these problems. The other is, some retailers are putting specialized AI teams just only to focus on very tough and more deeper AI problems, depending on the scale and how big they are. So these teams will essentially focus and work with the vendors and to build this type of data.
Very interesting. I'm wondering, if Wall Street will kind of clue into synthetic data and maybe use that as a way of testing how sophisticated a retailer is by asking how sophisticated they are around synthetic data.
Yeah, absolutely. Because these are the kind of technologies that are sort of where the puck is going. And eventually things like this, like your data will be one of the KPIs to begin to analyze a company. How advanced you are, do you know your customers really well? Can you predict your customers? Because these things like today, right? If you look at how various hedge funds and various Wall Street firms how they predict sales for retailers. They basically they subscribe to these satellite companies that look at parking lots, and using machine learning, they count how many trucks are going in and out. And you can basically use those numbers to know how much sales, and you could predict how much sales is going to happen in the next quarter. And there are already established models and algorithms that are doing this, right? Similarly, there will be models that where one will look at the type of data and how well a company can actually, how much data does a company have? And that would be a KPI where you could measure how much data does a company have about its customers? How much data does a company know about its customers? How much data can it use to simulate their customer? And as privacy is getting stronger and stronger, and today I was reading the news, there are more government restrictions on consumer privacy, right? So as more and more privacy restrictions are coming, this type of technology is super important to companies, because this is how you're going to be knowing about your customers by doing these type of domain transfers and being able to generate content about them.
Oh, interesting. Let me make sure I understand what you just said there. So as privacy becomes more of an issue, and I'm fully in the camp of I want more privacy, not less privacy. A way around that is for retailers to create synthetic data to do. How does creating synthetic data assist or allow, or what? I don't know. What's the right word? How do I want to describe that? Operate in a pro-privacy scenario. I'm not saying that quite correctly, but unpack that a little bit more, Brian. That was a really interesting point you just said.
No, what's interesting there, Jeff, is I'll give you like a little bit of a practical example. I mean, if you look at a few years ago when Apple said we won't support cookies anymore. We won't support not cookies, but the universal ID on our apps. And mobile device manufacturers and even like Google's and the Apples of the world are putting restrictions on what can be captured. So if you're an advertiser and if you want to do data completion for Jeff's profile, right? So the way typically these type of data happens is that you track on your website that Jeff visits, Jeff's cookie. Then you can go to a third party and buy third party data, and you can kind of do a data completion, and you can understand Jeff similar profiles movement from online versus offline versus various forms of shopping. Now there is a lot of restrictions for companies to sell third party data. So if you had a lot of third party data in the past and you built your profiles and models, you could actually use synthetic to generate more data about people that you only have half of your data. And then the remaining completion could be domain transferred from what you had in the past. So that's the beauty of it, right? So, I mean, if you have absolutely no data, synthetic is not going to be helpful for you, right? But if you have had some data in the past, or if you have methods to get parts of the data, and you have other places where you have complete data, then synthetic becomes super interesting, right? In the ad world and in the CDP, the customer data world, where you're trying to understand a customer, in that given world, this is actually a problem because, as more and more restrictions come in, you cannot buy third party for data completion. There are restrictions on certain things you cannot do. So now, since over the years, you have a lot of data gathered where you did not have those restrictions. So you could use a lot of that data and do domain transfer. And that becomes interesting because you can still kind of have a closer accuracy and better targeting capabilities than others.
Very interesting. So, Brian, as always, I mean, we want to have a foot in the future, but we also want to have another foot planted firmly in today. So if I'm a retail executive, if I'm driving innovation, if I'm anybody in retail that's worried about how to do business in the next 3 or 4 years, what do I do next Monday with all this information we just talked about?
So that's a great question. In fact, that's one of the things we always close our show with, right? So I think the first thing I would do is to look at within your organization and look at places where you do not have sufficient data, or generating new data can give you an edge. So this goes back to the use case, as I always say, right? Figure out what are the correct use cases for your organization and ask the right questions. Because one of the problems in data is, a lot of times, leaders ask questions about data, but then, after the meeting is over, once they see a piece of PowerPoint, and they're very happy and then just go their merry ways, right? Ask deep questions, whether is this data just a PowerPoint or does it actually exist? Can you capture this type of data on ongoing basis, right? What are we missing when it comes to data? And what could have we captured that we have not captured? So ask all those questions and figure out where generation of data can help you to kind of can train your models better. Because one thing that's really interesting about this data play piece, Jeff, as we spoke earlier as well, is that this gives you a competitive advantage, right? Because you can know your customers better, you can know their profiles better, you can generate things that you don't know about your customers, right? So it gives you this contextual AI, right? Because the beautiful thing about AI is AI itself, the application of AI within organizations is evolving. So we are getting to this point where we are going to be having contextual AI. So at any given, I'll give you a classic example, right? Like today you're seeing retargeting everywhere. It's been around for years, right? Where you shop for a Hawaii vacation and you come back from the Hawaii vacation, they're still advertising you. Wherever you go, you see like a Hawaii vacation ad, right? That is not contextual, because Jeff Roster today is not going to be the Jeff Roster 2 hours from now. Right? When you're going to be in San Francisco 2 hours from now, and you're going to be doing different things from what you're doing right now. So contextual AI is super, super important. So as contextual AI becomes critical, you want to be able to generate data, things that you don't know about a customer. That's why I think synthetic is going to be super interesting. So the first, just to kind of go back to the point, first is look at the use cases, understand what is critical, where can you gain competitive advantage, ask a lot of questions, and then finally, learn on this topic. When we publish this podcast as an article, either on Iterate AI or on the This Week in Innovation podcast, we will give you resources and links where you can look at and learn more about this field and how it can help your organization. Because I think knowledge is power, right? Spend some time learning about it. So that would be my advice, what you can do on Monday.
Very good. Sharmaran, Solomon, thanks as always. Brian, yet another interesting and a little bit scary look into the future. So a lot those of us in CPG and retail need to get up to speed with. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. As always, take care.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode. For more info, refer to the pod notes below. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps us grow. I'm your host, Jeff Roster, analyst at large. If you want to connect, follow us on Twitter at JeffPR or at BrianSathanation, or connect with us on LinkedIn. Visit my website at roster.retail.com or Brian's at iterate.ai. Until next time, stay safe and have a great week.